Once again, brothers and sisters, it is good to be with you. And all praises to the Most High. I'm your host, the Apostle Reuben of IUPR Bible Radio, podcasting out of Little Rock, Arkansas, to the true saints of the Most High God. Now, brothers and sisters, this is not going to be a long podcast episode. I want you to see something. Now, I'm at John 4:23. When it comes to worship, not a lot of it is talked about in the Christian church, and there's a reason why. Now, as you would know, we're going to be taking a look at what I consider to be serving and what I consider to be worship. Because I had to see what was said by the populace. I want you to pay attention to this. Is serving God and worshiping God the same? Watch this. No. Now, this is what they say. According to the Bible, there's no chapter and verse that would tell you the difference between the two. There is not one. Or they would have put up a example chapter and verse. It's not. This is them. Once again, this is their theory of the two. I want you to pay attention to what they say. No, according to the Bible, serve and worship are not exactly. Not exactly means they're the same. When they say not exactly, it means they're the same. They're just trying to cause confusion. That not exactly just means they're the same. Are not exactly the same thing. Although, now here comes the trick. Serving can be considered an act of worship. I thought it wasn't. See, that's what it meant by not exactly, because they're lying. To serve God and to worship him was the same, but they put their own distinction between the two, and there was a reason why. It was reasons why. You're going to see in this podcast episode. While worship is a more encompassing act of reverence and adoration toward God, serving is putting that reference into action by helping others and fulfilling God's will through practical deeds. Wait a minute. That's not worship? Seems like that's how you would worship. The same as serve. If you worship God, you're going to put into action things to help others learn how to fulfill the will, just like you would if you served him. But they're trying to put a distinction between the two for confusion. Now, I want you to look at this, John 4:23. And this is what our people, they don't know, because they're not reading people like you and I. See, brothers and sisters, this is a beautiful picture here. Actually, two pictures. This is beautiful. To read the book will always be better. Always be better than sitting listening to some church music and singing and dancing without understanding of the Bible. Our people love to sing and bojangle in the brick buildings, wooden buildings on a corner, rather than be reading people. This is what they choose. This is why, brothers and sisters, they are trapped in Christmas and birthdays. Because they actually think that you can worship God and do this too, and be in error with these two types of, I would call them acts, for lack of a better term. Now, we're going to go into the book of John 4, verse 23. Just read. We're going to read two verses. John 4:23. But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh such to worship him. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. So the only way God seeketh for you to worship him is in your spirit and in truth. In your spirit and in truth. In truth. That's the only way you can worship him. In spirit and in truth. So we're going to take a look at the spirit because the spirit is simple. Let's get the book of Ephesians, chapter 4, real quick. Ephesians 4. Verse 22. That ye put off concerning the former conversation, the old man which is corrupt according to the deceitful lust. Lust of sins. James 1:14, 15. Well, watch this. And be renewed in the spirit of your mind. So your mind is the spirit. So when Christ says worship him in spirit, it means your mind. So we're not going to go into that. What I wanted you to see was that the spirit was your mind. The spirit is your mind. Now, in truth, it's going to be found, because I'm going to go back and take a look. We're together going to go back and take a look at what it meant to worship him in truth. Now, I want to go to Psalms real quick. Psalms 112, verse 1. Psalms 112 and 1. Praise ye the Lord. Blessed is the man that feareth the Lord, that delighteth greatly in his commandments. Blessed is the man that feareth the Lord. So, what we want you to see, brothers and sisters, is when you fear God, you are keeping his commandments. When you fear God. We're going to read it again. Praise ye the Lord. Blessed is the man that feareth the Lord, that delighteth greatly in his commandments. So, when you fear the Lord, you delight in his commandments. You keep his commandments. Ecclesiastes 12:13 again. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Fear God. Fear God and keep his commandments. Fear God. That is how you fear God, by keeping his commandments. And when you go to the gospel, the chapter in Revelation, we're going to show you real quick in Revelation 14. Revelation 14, verse 6. Pay attention. And I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, and to every nation and kindred and tongue and people, saying with a loud voice, Fear God, and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of water. So when he says, fear God, that's to keep his commandments, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him. How are you going to worship him? By fearing him. And you're going to see that from both testaments, to worship him was to fear him. We're going to come back here, but let's focus on in truth. Let's focus on in truth. Let's go back to John 4 and read John 4, because I don't want you to forget the thought. John 4 and verse 24, real quick. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit, in their minds, and in truth. So let's go to the book of Joshua. A couple of verses in the Old Testament. Joshua chapter 24. Verse 14, real quick. Let's start in verse 13. And I have given you a land for which ye did not labor. You didn't work for. And cities which ye built not. And you dwell in them. And the vineyards and olive yards which ye planted not, do ye eat. Pay attention. Now therefore fear the Lord. That's to keep the law. You saw it. Ecclesiastes 12:13. Psalms 112 and 1. And fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in truth. There you go. And in truth. So when you were serving, which is worshiping God in truth, it is because you feared him, which is kept the commandments. So serving God in truth was to keep the commandments. That's what you see. And serve him in truth. In truth. In truth. In truth. Pay close attention. Deuteronomy 6. Deuteronomy 6. Chapter and verse now. How they worshiped him. They feared him, and that fear was how they worshiped him. Now, this is how Israel worshiped, not how the other nations worshiped, because they didn't have a God. You got to see this. You have to see this. Deuteronomy 6:17. You shall diligently keep the commandments of the Lord your God, and his testimonies, and his statutes which he hath commanded thee. Pay attention. And thou shalt do that which is right and good in the sight of the Lord. So when you keep his commandments, when you are keeping the commandments of the Lord and his testimonies and statutes, when you're keeping them, you're doing that which is right and good in the sight of the Lord. So when you keep his commandments, you're doing that which is good in his sight, which is right in his sight, that it may be well with thee, and that thou mayest go in and possess the good land which the Lord swore unto thy fathers. So when you keep the law, you are doing what was good. What was good. So when we go to 1 Samuel, 1 Samuel 12. Verse 23. Because we need to find this out. 1 Samuel 12:23. Moreover, as for me, God forbid that I should sin against the Lord and ceasing to pray for you. But I will teach you the good and the right way. What was the good and the right way? The laws. To do that which was good and right was in keeping the law. Deuteronomy 6:18. Pay attention to the next verse. Only fear the Lord. Keep the commandments. Fear the Lord is to keep the commandments and serve him in truth. In truth with all your heart. For consider how great things he has done for you. So when you were worshiping him in truth, it was because you feared him, which is keep his commandments. Served and worship is the same thing. Don't let them trick you. When you served God in truth, it's because you feared him. This is written. Now we're going to show you the same thing. The same thing. We're going to show you the same thing in Psalms 5. Psalms 5. Psalms 5 and 5. The foolish shall not stand in thy sight. Thou hatest all workers of iniquity. Iniquity is sin. So you hate. God hates all sinners here in this verse. He hates sinners. It doesn't say he hates the sinner. It doesn't say he hates the sin, not the sinner. It says he hateth all workers. Workers are those that do the sin. So he hates the workers of iniquity. So God hates the sinner as well as the sin. These pastors, they be lying. Oh, God hates the sin, not the sinner. That's a lie. I can show you another verse in Psalms 11. Psalms 11, verse 5 again. It's recorded. The Lord trieth the righteous, but the wicked and him that loveth violence his soul hateth. The wicked is the sinner, and his soul hateth sinners. Come on now. But let's go back to Psalms 5. Talk about this worship for a second. Psalms 5, verse 5. The foolish shall not stand in thy sight. Thou hatest all workers of iniquity. Thou shalt destroy them that speak leasing. The Lord will abhor the bloody and deceitful man. Abhor means hate. But watch this. But as for me, I will come into thy house in the multitude of thy mercies, and in thy fear. In thy fear. What does it mean to fear God? To keep the commandments. In thy fear will I worship. Will I worship? When they worshiped, let's go back and take a look at in thy fear. What was his fear? Psalms 119, verse 172. Then I got to go to another one. This is chapter and verse, brothers and sisters. We asked the Christians to prove that they worship God without law. They can't prove that. We know they can't. Psalms 119, verse 172. It says, my tongue shall speak of thy word, for all thy commandments are righteousness. So the word of God was the law. I want you to see this. My tongue shall speak of thy word, for all thy commandments are righteousness. So his word was the commandments. So when we go to Psalms 119, verse 38, establish thy commandments, which was his word, unto thy servant, who is devoted to thy fear. God's fear was in the law. It says when he says devoted, that is what made men devout. They were devoted in the fear, which is in the keeping of his word, which is the law. That's what his fear is, his word. So when we go back to Psalms 5, when it says thy fear is in his word, Psalms 5. Psalms 5, verse 7. Once again. But as for me, I will come into thy house in the multitude of thy mercy, and in thy fear, according to thy word, according to thy law, will I worship toward thy holy temple. So when they worshiped God, they worshiped according to the fearing, which is the keeping of the law. There's no other way to fear God but to keep his laws. This is what we're showing you. This is what we're showing you. We're making sure you see this, because we're using the term worship. Nehemiah 9. Nehemiah 9. Let's go to the rebuilding. Let's go to the rebuilding, these two books. Nehemiah 9 and 2. And the seed of Israel separated themselves from all strangers. The strangers were the other nations and themselves that chose to be and stay among them, and stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of their fathers. They confessed their sins. Now, when they confessed them, Proverbs, look at this, Proverbs. Let's see how they did that. Proverbs 28, verse 13. He that covereth his sins shall not prosper, but whosoever confesseth and forsaketh them, whosoever confess his sins and forsake them, which means stop sinning, them shall have mercy. So whoever forsaketh his sins and confesseth his sins shall have mercy. So you have to confess them and you have to forsake them. You have to stop. And in them, in doing that, you shall have mercy. So if you hold on to your sins, you're not going to prosper. And that prosper is talking about the kingdom, not now. You're going to see a lot of this. Brothers and sisters, many preachers prosper. Many preachers prosper. But they're not going to escape. They're not going to escape. We already know this. Better look at Ecclesiastes. Pay attention to this. Ecclesiastes. We already know they're not going to escape. It's going to be hard for them. Watch this, Ecclesiastes. I'm going to read verse 11. Because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, because God has not judged these liars. Therefore, the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. Let's see who's doing the evil. Though a sinner, that's who's doing the evil, a transgressor of the law, do evil 100 times, and his days be prolonged. You have some of these preachers live a long life. Yet, surely I know that it shall be well with them that fear God, that keep his commandments, which fear before him. It's going to be well with those that keep the law. Believe you me, it's going to be well with us. We keep this law, in time we're going to see. But it shall not be well with the wicked, the sinner. Neither shall he prolong his days. He will not get eternal life, which are as a shadow, because he feareth not before God. Because he feareth not God, which is break his laws, he will not prolong his days in the kingdom. By getting to the kingdom, I should say. He's not going to get there. He's not going to get there. So you must forsake your sins. But let's go back to Nehemiah 9. Nehemiah 9. Now I want you to, I'm just doing this, brothers and sisters, because I want you to see. Nehemiah 9 and 3. And they stood up in their place and to read the book of the law of the Lord their God. Let me go back up and read this. And then I'm going to go on down. Sorry about that. And the seed of Israel separated themselves from all strangers and stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of their fathers. Confess them now. And they stood up in their place and read in the book of the law of the Lord their God, 1/4 part of the day. That's for 3 hours. It's 12 hours in a day. So if it's 3, 3, 3, and 3, that's one part will be 3 hours. The second part will be 3 hours. They're not doing that in Sunday. We were talking about straight up reading. They read in the book of the law of the Lord their God. They read it. For 3 hours, they read the Bible. For 3 hours. This is how serious it was. They're not going to read. These men are not going to read the Bible straight for 5 minutes, maybe 3 minutes. They may give you a quoted verse out of the Bible and a bunch of talking. So we know it's not talking about them. We already know that. And they stood up in their place and read in the book of the law of the Lord their God, 1/4 part of the day. And another 4th part they confessed. Once they saw the book of the law, they confessed and worshiped according to that law, the Lord their God. The worship came according to the law. They read in the book of the law, 1/4 part, and another they confessed, because when they read in the book of the law, they were able to understand that it was an iniquity. Let me show you the law that they may have been reading. Let's go to Joshua. Joshua 23. Joshua 23, I think. This was the law. Joshua 23, verse 12. Else if ye do in any wise go back and cleave unto the remnant of these nations, strangers, even these that remain among you, and ye shall make marriages with them, and go in unto them, and they to you. Know for a certainty that the Lord your God will no more drive out any of these nations from before you, but they shall be snares and traps. Those nations are going to be snares and traps unto you. They shall be snares and traps. Here's 2 examples of snares and traps. Having you think you can worship God and do these false acts. This is a snare and trap that is caused by these other nations. Basically, he's the snarer, he's the trapper when it comes to this. Watch, let's go back up. Know for a certainty that the Lord your God will no more drive out any of these nations from before you, but they shall be snares and traps unto you, and scourges in your side, and thorns in your eyes, until ye perish off the good land which the Lord your God hath given you. So be careful, because they're going to be snares and traps. Now, during the time that Cyrus the king had let Nehemiah, Ezra go, Ezra to rebuild the temple, Nehemiah to rebuild the wall, they're back in their own land again. And watch what happens when they read the law. Look what happens. Nehemiah 9. Watch this again. Nehemiah 9. And the seed of Israel separated themselves from all strangers, and stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of their fathers. And they stood up in their place and read the book of the law of the Lord their God. See, when they read in the book of the law, they understood that they were not supposed to be mixed with them, or they would be inside of the worships of those nations, which was snares and traps. Snares and traps. And because our people won't read, they'll just go through life celebrating. It'll be all about the bojangling, the church music. See, this is designed by this man. In his cemetery schools of death, producing these preachers, so-called pastors. And they stood up in their place and read in the book of the law of the Lord their God, 1/4 part of the day, and another 4th part they confessed. They confessed the sins that they done, and they worship him according to what was written in the book of the law, the Lord their God. Not everybody's God, their own God, the God of Israel. So worship came in the form of law keeping. There was no such thing as you worshiping God according to any other way except law keeping. And we're going to show you it did not change. Let's get Psalms 40 and 8. Let's get Psalms. We're going to show you that it didn't change. To worship God was to worship him by law. He didn't want to be worshiped any other way but by the law. And we're going to show you by the fear. Psalms 40. Psalms 40 in verse 7. Pay attention. Then said I, Lo, I come in the volume of the book. It is written of me. I delight to do thy will, O my God. Yea, thy law is within my heart. The will of God is in the keeping of the law. I delight to do thy will, O my God. Yea, thy law, which is his will, is within my heart. Thy law is within my heart. That's how I'm doing your will, when I'm keeping the law. Now, let's go to the book of Romans. Let's go to the book of Romans. Chapter 2. Verse 17 again. Obvious. Behold, thou art called a Jew, and restest in the law, and makest thy boast of God, and knowest his will, and approvest the things that are more excellent, being instructed out of the law. Why? Because the will of God was in the law, like you read in Psalms 40 and 8. Don't let these Christians trick you by trying to teach you another will. According to John 6 and 40, it says, see, we're telling you how it works. According to John 6 and 40, see, this is what they're teaching now. And this is the will of him that sent me, that everyone which seeth the Son and believeth on him may have everlasting life. and I will raise him up at the last day. See how they took the wording and changed it around? Everyone that believeth on the Son. The will of him is to believe on the Son, no longer in keeping the law. The will of him is to believe on his Son. No, that believe on the Son is more than you think. Because when you believeth on Christ, that's why he says in John 12, John 12. We're going to go for verse 46. Christ says, I am come a light into the world, that whosoever believeth on me should not abide in darkness. And darkness is sin. If you believe on him, you shall not be sinning. Darkness is sin. He says, whosoever believeth on me shall not abide in darkness. And darkness is what? We're going to go straight to it. We're going to show you who's in darkness. Proverbs, real quick, just quick. You got to, this got to be proved to you. It has to be proven. Proverbs 4:19. The way of the wicked, which is the sinner. So when we're looking at the wicked, what is the works of the wicked? Let's look at the works of the wicked real quick, and you're going to see. Proverbs 10:16. The labor of the righteous tendeth to life. The fruit, which is the works of the wicked, to sin. So the wicked are sinners. The wicked are sinners. So let's look at this. Proverbs 4:19. The way of the sinners is as darkness, because that is who's in darkness. That is who commits the darkness. Sinners. They know not at what they stumble. They can't see. They can't see that you cannot serve God and keep these so-called feasts that was created literally by Edom as a snare and a trap. It's the same old idol worship, brothers and sisters. Same old idol worship. So when you, let's go back to John 12. Make sure you understand this. John 12, verse 46. I am come a light into the world, that whosoever believeth on me should not abide in sins, because darkness is where sinners abide. You shall not abide in darkness where sinners abide. So you cannot believe in Christ and abide among sinners. You cannot believe in Christ and abide among sinners or in your sins. You cannot. But these Christians teach you can believe on Christ and be a sinner. You can't. He says, if you believeth on me, you should not abide in darkness. So when we go back to John 6, I want you to look at this now, because they do this with these verses. And this is the will of him that sent me, that everyone which seeth the Son and believeth on him. Can you believe on him and sin? No, you cannot believe on him and sin. So believing on him is keeping law. If you're not sinning, you're keeping law. If you're not sinning, it's only two ways to go. If you're not sinning, you're keeping the law. So to believe on him is to keep law. Now, I want to go back to Romans, because I want to show you what Paul did. Paul straightened this out. Romans 2. See, if it wasn't for that, they'd have a case. But Paul came back and knoweth his will, and approveth the things that are more excellent, being instructed out of the law. So when you were instructed out of the law, you knew his will. When you were instructed out of the law, you knew his will and was able to approve the things that are more excellent. So when you knew the law, you knew his will and how to prove what was more excellent. So the will is in the law, like it says in Psalms 40:8. There's no escape. So when we go to John 9, let's go to John. John 9. Now, Christ healed a blind man, and they're questioning him. And we're going to get to a point to where I want to get to, because I don't want to make this that long. John 9:29. We know that God spake unto Moses, as for this fellow, Christ, we know not from whence he is. We don't know where this man comes from, but watch. And the man answered and said unto them, why herein is a marvelous thing, that ye know not from whence he is, and yet he hath opened my eyes. Now here we go. Here's the verse. we know that God heareth not sinners. So God doesn't hear sinners. But if a man be a worshiper of God and doeth his will, what was his will? The keeping of the law. See, you got to separate this. That's why you got to prove what the will was. The will was in the keeping of the law. That's why when we go back to Romans, they can't escape Romans. Romans 2. And we're coming back to John 9:31. Romans 2, verse 18. And knowest his will, and approvest the things that are more excellent, being instructed out of the law. So, when you were instructed out of the law, you knew his will and how to approve the things that are more excellent. So, when you were instructed out of the law, you knew his will because his will was in the law, like it says here, Psalms 40. We're showing you this now. We hope you can get it. Psalms 40, verse 8. David writes, I delight to do thy will, O my God. Yea, thy law is within my heart. The will of God was found in the law, and Paul confirmed it in Romans 2:18. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. So when we go back to John 9, we go back to John 9, verse 31. Now we know that God heareth not sinners. Sinners. Hold up. I want to make sure you get this, brothers and sisters. 1 John 3. 1 John 3. Verse 4. Whosoever committeth sin transgresseth also the law, for sin is transgression of the law. So a sinner is a transgressor of the law. A sinner is a transgressor of the law. Back to John 9. Back to John. John 9. John 9. A sinner would be a transgressor of the law. John 9:31. Now we knoweth that God heareth not transgressors of the law. But if a man be a worshiper of God, and doeth his will, hear me here. So when you are a worshiper of God, it is because you're doing his will. What was his will? In the law. So if you're a worshiper of God, you'll be doing his will, which is keeping his law. It never changed. Those that worship God kept law. Those that worship God kept law. There was no such thing as you being a worshiper of God and keeping Christmas and birthdays. There was no such thing. You could not do false worships and be a worshiper of God. You couldn't. That's where they fall short. Our people can't understand that. Why? Because they're not reading people. They're not. They don't read the Bible. It's like it's been shut off. They have no interest. Their interest is like the interest of their forefathers. That was without understanding. And they're doing the same thing today, singing without understanding. 400 years then passed, and they're doing the same thing. And our people love it so. They love it. They love it. So when you were a worshiper, it is because you were doing his will, which was in the law. In the keeping of the law, you were doing his will. Too many verses to back it up. When you were a worshiper of God, look at what's going on. Pay attention to the verse. Now we know God heareth not those that transgress the law. But on the other side, if any man be a worshiper, so a worshiper is not a sinner. You cannot sin and be a worshiper of God. That's what this verse is saying. Clear cut. But if a man be a worshiper of God and doeth his will is in the law. Him he heareth. This shows you that it stays the same. And right here, brothers and sisters, here is the nail in the coffin. Acts 24. This is Paul when he went to Felix. Acts 24, verse 14. Pay attention. There was no such thing as worshiping God without law. Acts 24:14. But this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship. Paul says, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets. So Paul worshiped according to everybody else, how everybody else worshiped in the law. Here it is. You can't beat this. You can't beat this. Paul says, I worship believing everything written in the law and in the prophets, because that's how they worship God, believing what was written in the law and in the prophets. The law and in the prophets. The law and in the prophets. That's how they worship. They did not worship God any other way but according to what was written in the law and the prophets. Both testaments say it. When they were worshiping him in the fear, it was according to the law. Here it is, clean cut. Paul worshiped according to what was written in the law, like everybody else. There was no such thing as you being able to keep false worships and still worship God. Or I should say false feasts that are not in the Bible as kept by the children of Israel. None of these feasts were legit. Neither one of these were legit. None of these, of these two. Well, I should say none of these, but because I mean baby day, dog day, cat day, bird day, tree day, rock day, sky day, whatever day. You did that, you were not worshiping God. So look at this. But this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship, or serve I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets. So Paul worshiped according to what the law said. So Romans, it doesn't change. Romans 7, verse 14. For we know that the law is spiritual. Now, look at this. But I am carnal, sold under sin. Wouldn't you know, brothers and sisters, the law is spirit. When it says the law is spiritual, the law is spirit. Paul just let us know that the law is spirit. The law is spirit. So when we go to Philippians, got to look at the verses in the Bible. Philippians 3. Verse 2. Watch Paul. Beware of dogs, beware of sin, evil workers. Evil workers are sinners. A sinner does the evil, Ecclesiastes 8 and 12. Beware of the concision. Pay attention. For we are the circumcision which worship God in the spirit. We worship God in the spirit. What was spirit? The law. They worshiped according to law and rejoice in Christ the Messiah and have no confidence in the flesh. What was the flesh? What was the flesh? The priesthood. That was the flesh. When it says have no confidence in the flesh, we go on down and see what that flesh was. Though I might also have confidence in the flesh, if any other man thinketh that he hath whereof I might trust in the flesh, that he might trust in the flesh, I more trust in it. Here's what it is: circumcise the 8th day, the stock of Israel. Circumcise the 8th day of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, and Hebrew of the Hebrews, as touching the law of Pharisee, because the Pharisee, they dealt with the flesh, and the flesh was the temple. That's why 1 Corinthians, we always take you here. 1 Corinthians 10:18. We're going to show you what that flesh was. Flesh. We're going to show you what the flesh was. Behold, Israel after the flesh. Are not they which eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? So anything after the flesh was after the altar and sacrifice. And Paul, as a Pharisee, he had confidence in the flesh. But now, Philippians 3 and 3, he's letting you know what he moved past. Philippians 3. Look at this now. For we are the circumcision, the Pharisee, which worship God in the spirit, which is by the law. The law was spiritual. See, you worship God by law. And rejoice in Christ the Messiah, and have no confidence in the temple. We have no confidence in the priesthood, the flesh. Every time you see worship, it's according to law. And this is what we know. That's why when we go to Jeremiah, they have no clue. Jeremiah 10, verse 2. Thus saith the Lord, learn not the way of the heathen, and be not dismayed at the signs of heaven, for the heathen are dismayed at them. For the customs of the people are vain. For one cutteth a tree. I'm showing you, brothers and sisters, one cutteth a tree out of the forest, and the work of the hands of the workman, with an axe, they cut the tree down. They deck it with silver and with gold. What do you see with the picture on the right? This is exactly what they are describing him. This isn't a worship of what the people of God were doing. This is a heathen worship. Heathen. They deck it with silver and with gold. They fasten it with nails and with hammers, that it move not. They are upright as the palm tree, but speaketh not. They must needs to be born, which is carried, because they cannot go. Be not afraid of them, the ideas of the heathen, for they cannot do evil, neither also it is in them to do good. Neither also is it in them to do good. So when we look at the Bible, you can see they deck it with silver and with gold. They deck it with silver and with gold. The picture on the right. They deck it with silver and with gold. They fasten it with nails and with hammers, that it move not. They were doing this with the tree and the presence hundreds of years before Christ was born. But our people, they cannot understand, because they have been told by these men that you can worship God and do these false acts. They were told this. Now, I want to go to Matthew. Matthew chapter 15. Matthew chapter 15, verse 6. And honor not his father or his mother. His father and his mother is found in the 10 commandments. Honor not his father and mother. That's found. And honoreth not his father or his mother. He shall be free. Thus you have made the commandment of God of none effect by your tradition. So it was a such thing as making the commandments of God of none effect by tradition, by a tradition. And when you ask most Sunday keepers, they say they keep it because of tradition. Christmas keepers, tradition. Birthdays, tradition. Everything is tradition of men. But pay attention. Ye hypocrites. Well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying, this people draweth near unto me with their mouth, and honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Why? But in vain do they worship me. In vain do they worship me. What does that mean? In vain do they worship me. What does it mean to worship God in vain? Let's go back and look at Psalms. What is this vain? Psalms 119. verse 12. Psalms 119, verse 112. I have inclined my heart to perform thy statutes always, even unto the end. I hate vain thoughts. There it is. But thy law do I love. Here we go. David says, I hate vain thoughts, but I love thy law. So what is vain is against the law. That's what we've been trying to tell you. Vain worship is against the law. To worship God in vain was against the law. See, when we go up to Psalms 119, verse 37, David says, turn away my eyes from beholding vanity. Vanity is the same as vain. And quicken me in thy way, which is thy law. David says, don't let me see vain things. Quicken me in thy way, which is thy law. Thy laws. We know that its way is the law. That's why it says, I will run the way of thy commandments, the way of his commandments, when thou shalt enlarge my heart. So the way of God, watch this, verse 33. Teach me, O Lord, the way of thy statutes, and I shall keep it until the end. The way, his way was the law. So when we go, turn away mine eyes from beholding sin, vanity, empty things, and quicken thou me in thy law. So vanity is the same as vain. And so anything that is against the law is vain. And that's how our people like to worship God, against the law. That's why Christ said this back in Matthew. Back in Matthew chapter 15. Verse 8, this people draweth nigh unto me with their mouth, and honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Their minds are far from him. Why? Because they don't read. But in vain, against the law, do they worship me, teaching for doctrines and commandments of men. And the doctrines and commandments of men is this here. A commandment of man, a doctrine of man, is Christ being born on the same day trees were worshipped. This is why we know that these churches are phony. Christ says, but in vain against the law do they worship me. And that's what our people do on Sunday. They worship God against the law. On Christmas, they worship God against the law. On Easter, they worship God against the law. And this man right here set the trap. He set the trap for our people to do that. He set the trap. They're set. They're in it. There's no way you can sit up here and tell me when you worship God, you were worshiping him by keeping law. That's why, brothers and sisters, when we go to, and I want to show you these three verses. When we go to Genesis chapter 40. When we go to Genesis 40 and 20, I want you to look at this. And it came to pass the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday. So here are heathens keeping birthdays. Brothers and sisters, they didn't say Israel was keeping the days. Egypt doesn't have a God. Pharaoh doesn't have a God. God only belonged to Israel. And it came to pass the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants, and lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. Birthday. He made a feast. Let's go to Mark 6:21. I want you to pay attention. Mark 6. We're going to take a look at the heathen again. Mark 6:21. And when a convenient day was come, convenient day, that Herod on his birthday, made a supper. Wait a minute now, it says made a supper. Now let's see what a supper is, and we're going to come back here. Let's get John 13. John 13, verse 1. Now before the feast of the Passover, when the Messiah knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. This puts John 3:16 to rest. Christ only loved his own according to this verse, not all nations. But watch this. And supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. But I want you to notice, now before the feast of the Passover and supper being ended. The feast was the same as supper. Feast and supper meant the same thing. Feast and supper meant the same thing. Let's go back to Mark. Mark 6. So feast and supper meant the same thing. Mark 6:21. And when a convenient day was come, that Herod on his birthday made a feast or a supper. Feast and supper meant the same thing to his lords, high captains, and chief estates of Galilee. So a supper was a feast. Again, on their birthdays, they had feasts. Now, when we go back to Job, because see, a lot of Christians, and see, the poison is they think they can do what they want and worship God. But watch this. Let's go to Job chapter 1. You can't deny this. We don't care if they do. We don't care. Job 1 and 4. Now, even before I go to Job 1 and 4, I want to go to Job 3. I want you to pay attention to this. It's going to show you. Job 3 and 1. After this opened Job his mouth and cursed his day. His day. I want you to understand when it says his day, it's not a misprint. It says his day. And Job spake and said, let the day perish wherein I was born. Job's day, his day, was the day he was born, and the night which it was said, there is a man-child conceived. His day was the day he was born. So his day, according to verse 1, was his birthday in verse 3. His day was his birthday. Now, let's go to Job 1, verse 4. That's verse 3. His substance also was 7,000 sheep, and 3,000 camels, and 500 yokes of oxen, and 500 she-asses, and a very great household, so that this man was the greatest of all the men of the east. And his sons went and feasted. Notice, feasted in their house, everyone his day. His day is his birthday. These so-calleds try to make it look like, no, his day is, it says his day. Everyone his day, not a day. You can't change it. The same way the Gentiles feasted on their birthdays is the same way Job's sons, who was in the land of Uz, feasted on their day, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and to drink with them. Now, look, I want you to pay attention to this, because verse 4 and 5 go together. Now we're going to read them both again. And it was so, when the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. In order to offer up burnt offerings, you had to be a priest. Not anyone can do that. For Job said, it may be that my sons have sinned. How have they sinned? Because they were feasting on their own day. When did God allow us to feast on our own day? He never did. That is why the heathen did it. Pharaoh did it, Gentile. Herod did it, Edom, Gentile. They were celebrating birthdays, not the people of God. God never gave Israel the liberty or a law saying you could celebrate and feast on your own day. He never gave it. But these so-called brothers and sisters, these so-called, man, that join hand in hand with Esau will try to change and manipulate what I just read to try to keep on pushing the lie that you could serve. It's no problem with God you keeping your birthday. No, that is not true. And his sons went and feasted in their houses, everyone his day. His day was his birthday. We read what his day was in Job 3:1. And sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and to drink with them. His day. Which means there was a day that belonged to him. Can't get away. And it was so. It was so. And when the days of their feasting were gone about, Job sent and sanctified them. He tried to separate them and rose up early in the morning and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all his sons. For Job said, it may be that my sons have sinned. How? How did they sin and curse God? Because to curse God is the sin. Now you know what it means to curse God is to sin in their hearts, in their minds. Thus Job did continually. But what is it? Why did it have been my sons have sinned? The only way that we know they have sinned in context is by they feasting in their houses, everyone his day, like the heathen did. The heathen feasted on their day, which was their birthday. The children of Israel were never given the law about a birthday. And when you're worshiping God, you're worshiping by law. So you cannot sit up here and tell me when you go to John 4, John 4, 24. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. If they are keeping these days, they are not worshiping God in spirit and in truth. They are not. This is why we're telling you, when they keep this is the big part about it. When you keep these phony false worships, you're worshiping the gods of the heathen. This is a heathen god, the white image of Christ. When you worship him, you worship the ideas. And his ideas is that you can worship him in a lie. This is what Christ meant. This is what Christ meant when he says, in vain do they worship me, in emptiness and lies. Matthew again. Matthew 15. Matthew 15. No matter how you slice it, you cannot worship God lying. But in vain do they worship me. In lies. They worship God in lies. Teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. The commandments of men is when other men and how they keep these false acts. Jeremiah 10, 3 and 4, we already know. The tree, the decorating with silver and gold. The birthday was done by the heathen. When you worship God in spirit and in truth, you worshiped him by law. There was no other way to worship him. That's why I went that route. When you worship him in spirit, in your mind, and in truth, you're worshiping him by his laws. Because that's how you worship him. They that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And truth is by law. That's why it says again in John 9. Now we know that God heareth not sinners, the transgressors of the law. They that keep Easter, Christmas, Baby Day, Dog Day. This is sin. This is sin. But if a man be a worshiper of God and doeth his will, him he heareth. When you're a worshiper of God, you're doing his will. which is keeping law. Paul did that. Paul showed you what it was like to worship God. You can't change this verse. This verse is the wrench, the little monkey wrench you can throw in their clockwork of deceit. But this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I as Paul, the God of my fathers. How did I worship him? How did I worship God? Believing in all things which were written in the law and in the prophets, like it did in the Old Testament. Paul worshiped God according to the keeping of the law, as they did in the Old Testament. The fear and the keeping of the law was the same thing. So when you worship God, you were keeping law. There was no other way to worship him. No other way. But there's plenty of ways. There's plenty of ways to worship this false image here. When you worship the Caucasian image of Christ, which was the idea of these false teachers' forefather, now you can keep Christmas, Easter, Baby Day, Dog Day, Birthday, Cat Day, and still be justified. No, not according to the truth. When you worship God, it was by law. Not in vain. This is vain worship. And it's going to cost our people by worshiping him in vain. Let's get where we can see that. The book of Matthew. The book of Matthew chapter 7. Book of Matthew chapter 7. Verse 21. Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. In heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name? And in thy name have cast out devils, and in thy name done many wonderful works. And I will profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity. So when you were working iniquity, which is sin, you were not doing the will. You can't tell me you're doing the will of God in sin. No. Read it with me again. Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. Doeth the will. Doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. Pay attention. Many will say unto me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name? And in thy name cast out devils, and in thy name done many wonderful works? Then I will profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity, ye that sin. So the sinners were not doing the will of God. That's why when we go back, the sinners, again, let me repeat that, the sinners were not doing the will of God. The sinners were not doing the will because they've been rejected. When Christ says, depart from me, ye that sin, John 9. Look at this. John 9 again. John 9. See, we already know those that keep Easter, Christmas, Baby Day, Dog Day, they're not worshipers of God. They're worshipers of Esau, the devil. They're worshipers of him. They're worshipers of man. Watch this. And we know that God heareth not sinners. Sinners is iniquity. But if a man be a worshiper of God and doeth his will, so you cannot be a worshiper of God keeping Easter, Christmas, Baby Day, Dog Day, false worships, false feasts, false ideas of Caucasians. You cannot be a worshiper of God and do this. We already knew that. This is heathen practice here. So if you keep heathen practice, you're not a worshiper. Now, they could think they're a worshiper in their head, but they're going to be turned away. I never knew you. Christ is going to tell them, I never knew you. Now we know that God heareth not sinners, those that transgress the law. But if a man be a worshiper of God and doeth his will, which is in the law, him he heareth. So when we go back to Matthew 7, I want you to pay attention closely. Matthew 7. I got to get something else out of it. Matthew 7, verse 21. Not every one that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. You know who wasn't doing the will of God? Then I will profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity. Those that sin, they were not doing the will of God. Like it says in John 9:31. If you keep these false feasts that are in sin, you are not a worshiper. And you are not worshiping God in truth. You're worshiping him in vain, like Christ says in Matthew 15:9. And the price our people are going to have to pay by thinking that you could worship God and keep Easter, Christmas, Baby Day, Dog Day, they're going to be turned away for their iniquity. And the next step after that is the lake of fire. Death. Keep on. If our people, they're going to keep on thinking you could worship God any kind of way. You can't. You never could. The worship was in keeping of the law. And if you didn't, you worshiped him in vain. And with that, brothers and sisters, may the rest of your day be blessed. May the rest of your day be blessed. And all praises to the Most High that we have his word. So we that read won't have to ever worry about worshiping God and these phony practices and think we're actually doing it. We're not. We're actually, if we are keeping these worships, we're worshiping him. He is the blasphemer of God. There is no Bible verse that says you can worship God in vain or any. You worship God by keeping law. Both testaments. Remember this. This is important to those that keep unwrapping gifts under a tree. Their day is going to come. They're going to pay for it, brothers and sisters. So we hope that they can awaken, so they won't come to this point when Christ says, "Get away from me, ye that sin." Peace and love, brothers and sisters. All praises until next time. Going into Revelation 21 in our next podcast episode.